Today, we're digging into something truly timeless. It's a guide over 2,500 years old on how to manage the chaos that can happen inside our own minds. So if you've ever felt like your thoughts have a mind of their own, well, this one's for you.
I mean, really think about it for a second. We've all been there, haven't we? You get stuck in these anxious loops, or you're lost in distracting daydreams, or maybe it's just that negative self-talk that seems to pop up out of nowhere. It's a totally universal human struggle, this battle inside our own heads.
But what if I told you there's an ancient user manual for this exact problem? Today, we're exploring a text called the Vitakkasaṇṭhāna Sutta. Now, think of this less as some dusty old scripture and more like an incredibly practical psychological toolkit that is just as relevant today as it was 2.5 millennia ago.
All right, so how does this ancient manual break it all down? First, we're going to define the problem itself. What is the unruly mind? Then we'll get right into the toolkit, starting with something called the carpenter's peg and, get this, a technique called the revolting carcass. We'll also cover the averted gaze and then the final resorts for those really stubborn thoughts. And finally, we'll talk about the end goal, what it really means to master your thoughts.
Okay, so first things first, what kind of thoughts are we actually talking about here? Because the text gets super specific. This isn't about stopping all thinking. No, it's about dealing with a very particular type of thought that causes us real trouble.
The text uses a specific Pali term for them, papaka akasula vitaka. And this is so important because it doesn't just mean bad thoughts. The key word here is akasula, which really means unskillful or unhelpful. So we're talking about thoughts that are fundamentally counterproductive. You know, the ones tied to craving or anger or confusion, that at the end of the day just lead to more stress and suffering for you.
So, you've noticed one of these unskillful thoughts has just popped into your head. What's the very first tool you should reach for? Well, the text suggests something surprisingly elegant and simple, and it calls it the carpenter's peg.
The process itself is really straightforward. The moment you notice that harmful thought, you deliberately, consciously switch your attention to its opposite, something skillful, positive, or wholesome. And when you do that, the text says the negative thought just fades away. It can't compete for your mental bandwidth.
And the analogy they use just illustrates this idea perfectly. You can't just create a vacuum in your mind, right? Instead, you use a better, finer thought to actively push out a coarser, less helpful one. It's a direct act of replacement, not just simple removal. So clever.
Of course, we all know it's not always that simple. Some thoughts are just sticky. They're persistent, and they really don't want to be replaced. So, what do? What's the next step if the carpenter's peg just isn't working?
Well, that brings us to the next tool in our kit, which takes a completely different approach. If you can't just replace the thought, then it's time to investigate it, to really understand why you'd want to get rid of it in the first place.
The idea here is to examine the drawbacks of the thought. You have to reflect honestly with yourself. Ask yourself, is this line of thinking skillful? Is it leading anywhere good? And the answer is no. In fact, it's just going to cause me more stress and more suffering. The goal is to make the thought itself totally unappealing.
And the analogy for this one is incredibly vivid and powerful. The goal is to cultivate this natural sense of revulsion for these harmful thought patterns, to see them for what they are, like carrying around something dead and decaying. I mean, when you start to see the thought as genuinely disgusting, it just loses its power over you.
But what about those really stubborn thoughts? You know the ones that stick around even when you know they're bad for you, even when you see how harmful they are. Well, the toolkit has an answer for that too.
This brings us to our third technique, and it's basically a form of strategic neglect. So if you can't replace the thought, and investigating it doesn't make it go away, maybe it's time to just stop feeding it. Stop paying attention to it.
This is a conscious act. You are actively withdrawing your mental energy. You're not fighting the thought, you're not wrestling with it, you're just choosing not to engage. You kind of let it be there in the background, but you refuse to give it the spotlight of your attention.
I love this analogy because it's so intuitive, right? You can't always control what enters your field of vision, but you can always choose where you look. And in the exact same way, you might not be able to stop a thought from appearing in your mind, but you always have the choice to look away with your mind. All right, now we get to the heavy-duty tools. Think of these as the final resorts, the ones you pull out when a thought is exceptionally persistent and disruptive. And the first three techniques just haven't done the trick.
Okay, so here we have two very different approaches for the absolute toughest thoughts. Technique 4 is about calming the source. So instead of focusing on the thought itself, you focus on the process of thinking.
The analogy is like slowing down from a full-on run, to a walk, to standing still, and finally to just sitting. You're gently quieting the mental energy that creates the thoughts in the first place. But if that doesn't work, technique 5 is the last resort, brute force. The text literally says to clench your teeth, press your tongue to the roof of your mouth, and with your mind, forcefully pin down and crush that unwanted thought, like a strong person completely overpowering a weaker one.
So why go through all this trouble? The goal isn't just to be in a constant battle with our thoughts, not at all. It's about developing a whole new relationship with your mind, one where you are finally in the driver's seat.
So here it is, your complete 5-step toolkit, laid out in the exact order of application. You start with the gentlest method, replacement, and you only escalate when you absolutely have to. It's such a graduated, intelligent approach to managing our inner world.
And this, right here, is the ultimate prize. By practicing these techniques, you can become what the text calls a wasi vitakkapariyaya, a master of the pathways of thought. I mean, just imagine that for a second. Having the freedom to think whatever you want to think, and, maybe even more importantly, to not think about what you don't want to think about. That is real mental freedom.
So as you go about the rest of your day, I'll just leave you with this question. Our minds haven't really changed that much in 2,500 years, and the challenges we face inside our heads are just as real. Which of these ancient, powerful tools could you put into practice right now, today?